Welcome back, YouTube. Sensei Domino here. Today I'm going to be showing the 1986 Fleer baseball set. It's a 660 card set. As usual, I'll show the fronts and the backs of the first few cards. Then I'll just show the front so the video isn't too long. Start with card number 1, Steve Balboni. 1986 is a pretty important year in my collecting journey because it was the first full year that I collected and the first year that I collected baseball cards. I started late in 85 with football. And shortly thereafter, I started getting into baseball. Next, we have Joe Beckwith. So these 86 sets have always been pretty important to me. I already have the 86 Topps and the 86 Donruss. So now I have the 86 Fleer. Next we have the Buddy Biancalana. Bud Black. Hall of Famer George Brett. Onyx Concepcion. Steve Farr. Mark Gubicza. Dane Orge. Danny Jackson. Lynn Jones. Mike Jones. I like how Fleer does their numbering by team and then in alphabetical order per team. Charlie Leibrandt. Hal McRae. Omar Moreno. Darryl Motley. George Orta. Dan Quisenberry. Brett Saberhagen. Pat Sheridan. Lonnie Smith. Jim Sundberg. John Wathen. Frank White. Willie Wilson. Joaquin Andujar. Steve Braun. Bill Campbell. Cesar Cedeno. Jack Clark. Vince Coleman. Danny Cox. Ken Daly. Ivan DeJesus. Bob Forsch. Brian Harper. Tommy Herr. Ricky Horton. Kurt Kepshire. Jeff Lottie. Tito Landrum. Billy McGee. Terry Pendleton, Daryl Porter, Hall of Famer Ozzie Smith, John Tudor, Andy Van Slyke, Todd Worrell, Jim Aker, Doyle Alexander, Jesse Barfield, George Bell, Jeff Burrows, Bill Caudill, Jim Clancy, Tony Fernandez, Tom Filer, Damaso Garcia, Tom Hankey, Garth Orge, Cliff Johnson, Jimmy Key, Dennis Lamp, Gary Lavelle, Buck Martinez, Lloyd Mosby, Rance Mullenix, Al Oliver, Dave Steeb, Lewis Thornton, Willie Upshaw, Ernie Witt, Rick Aguilera, Wally Backman, Hall of Famer Gary Carter, Ron Darling, Lenny Dykstra rookie, Sid Fernandez, George Foster, Dwight Gooden, Tom Gorman, Danny Heap, Keith Hernandez, Howard Johnson, Ray Knight, Terry Leach, Ed Lynch, Roger McDowell, Jesse Orozco, Tom Paciorek, Ron Reynolds, Rafael Santana, Doug Sisk, Rusty Staub, Darryl Strawberry, Mookie Wilson, Neil Allen, Don Baylor, Dale Barra, Rich Bordy, Marty Bystrom, Joe Cowley, Fisher, Ken Griffey, Ron Guidry, Ron Hassey, Hall of Famer Ricky Henderson, Don Mattingly, Bobby Meacham, John Montefusco, Hall of Famer Phil Niekro, Mike Pagliarulo, Dan Pasqua, Willie Randolph, Dave Righetti, Andre Robertson, Billy Sample, Bob Shirley, Ed Whitson, Hall of Famer Dave Winfield, Butch Weiniger, Dave Anderson, Bob Baylor, Greg Brock, Enos Cabell, Bobby Castillo, Carlos Diaz, Mariano Duncan, Pedro Guerrero, Oral Hershiser, Rick Honeycutt, Ken Howell, Ken Landreau, Bill Madlock, Candy Maldonado, Mike Marshall, Len Matusek, Tom Niedenfuer, Alejandro Pena, Jerry Royce, Bill Russell, Steve Sachs, Mike Sosha, Fernando Valenzuela, Bob Welsh, Terry Whitfield, Juan Beniquez, Bob Boone, John Candelaria, Hall of Famer Rod Carew, Stu Clyburn, Doug DeSenses, Brian Downing, Ken Forsch, Craig Gerber, Bobby Gritch, George Hendrick, Al Holland, Hall of Famer Reggie Jackson, great image there, Rupert Jones, Urbano Lugo, Kirk McCaskill, Donnie Moore, Gary Pettis, Ron Romanek, Dick Schofield, Daryl Schooniers, Jim Slayton, Hall of Famer Don Sutton, Mike Witt, Buddy Bell, Tom Browning, Dave Concepcion, Eric Davis, Bo Diaz, Nick Osaski, John Franco, Tom Hume, Wayne Krenschicki, Andy McGaffigan, Eddie Milner, Ron Oster, Hall of Famer Dave Parker, Frank Pastore, Hall of Famer Tony Perez, Ted Power, Joe Price, Gary Reedus, Ron Robinson, Pete Rose, Mario Soto, John Stuper, Jay Tibbs, Dave Van Gorder, Max Venable, Juan Augusto, Hall of Famer Harold Baines, Floyd Bannister, Britt Burns, Julio Cruz, Joel Davis, Richard Dotson, Carlton Fisk, Hall of Famer, Scott Fletcher, Ozzie Guillen, rookie, Jerry Hairston, Tim Hewlett, Bob James, Ron Kittle, Rudy Law, Brian Little, Gene Nelson, Reed Nichols, Luis Salazar, Hall of Famer Tom Seaver, Dan Spillner, Bruce Tanner, Greg Walker, Dave Wehrmeister, Juan Berenguer, Dave Bergman, Tom Brookins, Daryl Evans, Barbara Garby, Kirk Gibson, John Grubb, Willie Hernandez, Lance Herndon, Larry Herndon, Chet Lemon, Aurelio Lopez, Jack Morris, Hall of Famer, Randy O'Neal, Lance Parrish, Dan Petrie, Alex Sanchez, Bill Scherer, Nelson Simmons, Frank Tanana, Walt Terrell, Hall of Famer Alan Trammell, Lou Whitaker, Milt Wilcox, Hubie Brooks, Tim Burke, Hall of Famer Andre Dawson, Mike Fitzgerald, Terry Francona, Bill Gullickson, Bryn Smith, Randy St. Clair, Scott Thompson, Tim Wallach, UL Washington, Mitch Webster, Herm Winningham, Floyd Yeomans, Don Ossie, Mike Boddicker, Rich Dower, Storm Davis, Rick Dempsey, Ken Dixon, Jim Dwyer, Mike Flanagan, Wayne Gross, Lee Lacey, Fred Lynn, Tippy Martinez, Dennis Martinez, Scott McGregor, Eddie Murray, Hall of Famer, Floyd Rayford, great Cal Ripken Jr., Hall of Famer, Gary Renicky, Larry Sheets, John Shelby, Nate Snell, Sammy Stewart, Alan Wiggins, Mike Young, Alan Ashby, Mark Bailey, Kevin Bass, Jeff Calhoun, Jose Cruz, Glenn Davis, Bill Dolly, Frank DePino, Bill Doran, Phil Garner, Jeff Heathcock, Charlie Kerfeld, Bob Nepper, Ron Mathis, Jerry Mumphrey, Jim Pankovitz, Terry Poole, Craig Reynolds, Hall of Famer Nolan Ryan. Show the back of that. Mike Scott, Dave Smith, Dickie Thon, Denny Walling, Kurt Bafakwa, Al Bumbry, Jerry Davis, Luis De Leon, Dave Dravecki, Tim Flannery, Steve Garvey, Hall of Famer Goose Gossage, the great Tony Gwynn, Hall of Famer, Andy Hawkins, Lamar Hoyt, Roy Lee Jackson, Terry Kennedy, Craig Lefferts, Carmelo Martinez, Lance McCullers, Kevin McReynolds, Greg Nettles, Jerry Royster, Eric Shaw, Tim Stoddard, Gary Templeton, Mark Thurmond, Ed Wojna, Tony Armas, Marty Barrett, Hall of Famer Wade Boggs, Oil Can Boyd, Bill Buckner, Mark Clear, second year Roger Clemens, Steve Crawford, Mike Easler, Dwight Evans, Rich Gedman, Jackie Gutierrez, Glenn Hoffman, Bruce Hurst, Bruce Keeson, Tim Lawler, Steve Lyons, Al Nipper, Bob Ojeda, Hall of Famer Jim Rice, Bob Stanley, Trujillo, Thad Bosley, Warren Brewstar, Ron Say, Jody Davis, Bob Dernier, Sean Dunston, Leon Durham, Hall of Famer Dennis Eckersley, Ray Fontenot, George Frazier, Billy Hatcher, Davey Lopes, Gary Matthews, Ron Meredith, Keith Moreland, Reggie Patterson, Dick Ruthven, Hall of Famer Ryan Sandberg, Scott Sanderson, Hall of Famer Lee Smith, Larry Sorensen, Chris Spire, Rick Sutcliffe, Steve Trout, Gary Woods, Burt Blyleven, Hall of Famer, Tom Bernansky, Randy Bush, John Butcher, Ron Davis, Dave Engel, Frank Euphemia, Pete Filson, Gary Gaetti, Greg Gagne. This is a great card right here. Mickey Hatcher. Look at that cool glove. Always love this image. Kent Herbeck. Tim Loudner. Rick Lysander. Dave Meyer. Hall of Famer Kirby Puckett, second year. Mark Salas. Ken Schramm. Roy Smalley. Mike Smithson. Mike Stenhouse. Tim Tuffle. Frank Viola. Ron Washington. Keith Atherton. Kind of a tongue twister. Dusty Baker. Tim Burtsis. Bruce Boakty. Chris Cotteroli. Dave Collins. Mike Davis. Alfredo Griffin. Mike Heath. Steve Henderson. Donnie Hill. Jay Howell. Tommy John. Dave Kingman. Bill Kruger, Rick Langford, Carney Lansford, Steve McCaddy, Dwayne Murphy, Steve Ontiveros, Tony Phillips, Jose Rio, Mickey Tettleton rookie, Luis Aguayo, Larry Anderson, Hall of Famer Steve Carlton, Don Carmen, Tim Corcoran, Darren Dalton rookie, John Denny, Tom Foley, Greg Gross, Kevin Gross, Vaughn Hayes, Charles Hudson, Gary Maddox, Shane Raleigh, Dave Rucker, John Russell, Juan Samuel, Hall of Famer Mike Schmidt, Rick Shue, Dave Shipinoff, Dave Stewart, Jeff Stone, Kent Tekulve, Ozzie Virgil, Glenn Wilson, Jim Beattie, Carl Best, Barry Bonnell, Phil Bradley, Yvonne Calderon rookie, Al Cowens, Alvin Davis, Dave Henderson, Bob Kearney, Mark Langston, Bob Long, Mike Moore, Ed Nunez, Spike Owen, Jack Perconti, Jim Presley, Donnie Scott, Bill Swift, Danny Tartable, Gorman Thomas, Roy Thomas, Ed Vandenberg, Frank Wills, Matt Young, Ray Burris, Jamie Kokenauer, Cecil Cooper, Danny Darwin, Hall of Famer Raleigh Fingers, Jim Gantner, Bob Gibson, Moose Haas, Teddy Higuera, Paul Householder, Pete Ladd, Rick Manning, Bob McClure, Hall of Famer Paul Molitor, Charlie Moore, Ben Oglivie, Randy Reddy, Ernie Riles, Ed Romero, Bill Schroeder, Ray Sarich, Hall of Famer Ted Simmons, Pete Vukovich, Rick Waits, Hall of Famer Robin Yount, Len Barker, Steve Bedrosian, Bruce Benedict, Rick Camp, Rick Cerrone, Chris Chambliss, Jeff Dedman, Terry Forster, Gene Garber, Terry Harper, Bob Horner, Glenn Hubbard, Joe Johnson, Brad Kamensk, Rick Mailer, Dale Murphy, Ken Obergfell, Pascual Perez, Gerald Perry, Rafael Ramirez, Steve Shields, Zane Smith, Hall of Famer Bruce Sutter, Milt Thompson, Claudell Washington, Paul Zavella, Vida Blue, Bob Brenly, Chris Brown, Chili Davis, Mark Davis, Rob Deere, Dan Dreesen, Scott Gereltz, Dan Gladden, Jim Gott, David Green, Atlee Hammaker, Mike Jeffcoat, Mike Krukow, Dave LaPointe, Jeff Leonard, Greg Minton, Alex Trevino, Manny Trio, Jose Uribe, Brad Wellman, Frank Williams, Joel Youngblood, Alan Bannister, Glenn Brummer, Steve Buchel, Jose Guzman, Toby Harrah, Greg Harris, Dwayne Henry, Bert Hooton, Charlie Huff, Mike Mason, Oda B. McDowell, Dickie Knowles, Pete O'Brien, Larry Parrish, Dave Razima, Dave Schmidt, Don Slott, Wayne Tollison, Dwayne Walker, Gary Ward, Chris Welsh, Curtis Wilkerson, George Wright, Chris Bando, Tony Bernizard, Brett Butler, Ernie Camacho, Joe Carter, Carmelo Castillo, Jamie Easterly, Julio Franco, Mel Hall, Mike Hargrove, Neil Heaton, Brooke Jacoby, Otis Nixon rookie, Jerry Reed, Vern Rule, Pat Tabler, Rich Thompson, Andre Thornton, Dave Von Olin, George Vukovic, Tom Waddell, Kurt Wardle, Jerry Willard, Bill Allman, Mike Bilecki, Sid Breen, Mike Brown, Pat Clements, Jose De Leon, Denny Gonzalez, Cecilio Guante, Steve Kemp, Sam Khalifa, Lee Mazzilli, Larry McWilliams, Jim Morrison, Joe Orsolak, Tony Pena, Johnny Ray, Rick Russell, R.J. Reynolds, Rick Rhoden, Don Robinson, Jason Thompson, Lee Tunnell, Jim Wynn, and Marvell Wynn. All right, next we have the Superstar Specials. Dwight Gooden, Gooden in action. Mattingly in action, Don Mattingly. Pete Rose commemorating 4192. .3,000 career hits for Rod Carew. .300 career wins for Tom Seaver and Phil Niekro. Ouch, Don Baylor. Instant offense, Tim Raines, Darryl Strawberry. Shortstop supreme, Alan Trammell and Cal Ripken. Boggs and hero, Wade Boggs, George Brett. Braves dynamic duo, Bob Horner, Dale Murphy. Cardinal igniters, Vince Coleman, Willie McGee. Terror on the base paths, Vince Coleman. Charlie Hustle and Dr. K, Pete Rose and Dwight Gooden. 84 and 85 AL batting champs, Don Mattingly, Wade Boggs. NL West sluggers, Dale Murphy, Steve Garvey, Dave Parker. Staff aces, Fernando Valenzuela, Dwight Gooden. Blue Jays stoppers, Jimmy Key, Dave Stieb. AL backstops, all-star backstops, Carlton Fisk and Rich Gedman. All right, next we're moving on to the rookies. We have Benito Santiago and Gene Walter. Mike Woodard and Colin Ward. Al Daniels and Paul O'Neill. Fred Tolliver and Andres Galarraga. Bob Kipper and Kurt Ford. The big card from the set. Eric Plunk and Jose Canseco, rookie. Gus Polidor and Mark McLemore. Rob Woodward and Mickey Brantley. Billy Joe Robideau and Mark Funderburk. And Cecil Fielder and Corey Snyder. Next we have the checklists. Royals, Cardinals, Blue Jays, Mets. Yankees, Dodgers, Angels, Reds, White Sox, Tigers, Expos, Orioles, Astros, Padres, Red Sox, Cubs, Twins, A's, Phillies, Mariners. 2 more to go. Brewers, Braves, Giants, and Rangers. This last one's probably going to be replaced. You'll see why on the back. The last one, Cleveland Indians, Pittsburgh Pirates, and then the special cards. This one, kind of notice it's got a little bit of tanning to it. It's clear that this set probably hadn't been touched in a while and sort of took some of that nasty exposure right there. So probably going to replace that at some point. But anyway, that's the set, the 1986 Fleer Baseball Complete set. Hopefully you enjoyed seeing that. Till next time, thanks for watching the video, and I'll talk to you again soon.